Would you like to learn how to make this traditional Icelandic dessert, Vinarterta? Stay tuned to the next episode of Hilltop Stovetop. Hello and welcome back to Hilltop Stovetop, the show where we're teaching you how to make great meals in an ordinary kitchen. Today we're making another family favorite, which is Vinarterta. And Vinarterta is a traditional Icelandic dessert. My family has been making it since they came to Canada. And interestingly enough, it's a dessert that the Icelandic immigrants brought to Canada. And they still continue to make it. You wouldn't think of having a Christmas thing without Vinarterta, as well as throughout the rest of the year. But in Iceland, you hardly hear about it at all anymore. At least that's what I understand. I've never been to Iceland myself, but they've moved on and make all kinds of other delicious and delightful things. But the Canadian people of Icelandic origin still love their Vinarterta. So that's what we're going to learn how to make today. It's an interesting dessert in that it's a Christmas cake. You have to make it ahead of time and let it age, not as long as a traditional fruit cake, like an English fruit cake, but you still want it to mellow a little bit. So I'm going to be putting it all together today, and we won't actually be eating it for about 4 days. Minimum 4 days. 4 days to a week is a good time frame for it to mellow. And basically what you do is we're going to make 7 big cookies and put layers of prunes in between that. So we're going to start off with just your typical cookie kind of batter. I've got a cup of butter, and again we want to make sure we're using good quality ingredients. And I've got a cup and a half of white sugar. And we're going to put that in and cream those two things together. And then we'll be adding some more ingredients. So we'll see you after this has had a chance to spin together. Okay, so there's several things that we're going to be doing along the way today that show how, even though this is an old recipe, we have added a whole lot of things that are making it much easier than when I was a kid and we were doing things by hand. Among them is being able to cream the butter and the sugar using an electric mixer. We're going to add in a couple of eggs, and we're going to add in a couple of teaspoons of vanilla. And a lot of recipes call for almond extract in this, and I personally don't use almond extract in mine because I have enough people that have allergies to nuts that I just stay away from that altogether. But if you want to make it a truly traditional thing, go ahead and put some almond extract in instead of half of that vanilla. And then we're adding cardamom. Now, this recipe calls for just a teaspoon of cardamom. Personally, I like a lot of cardamom flavor in this, so I'm actually adding a tablespoon, not a teaspoon. And I also add cardamom into the filling as well. And this to me is as the essence of this, having that cardamom flavor. Cardamom is a spice from India. You'll see it a lot in Indian food, and it's a main component of garam masala. But in Iceland, it gets used a lot in baking. There's several things, including if you look back at my video for making kleiner, I used nutmeg in that particular one, but cardamom is also a way to go. So lots of Icelandic baking has cardamom in that. So we're going to add that into the mix. We will, and we'll just mix this up and be right back. Okay, now I've got 3 tablespoons of milk. A lot of people will use cream, but I've got milk. I didn't have cream in the fridge. And then we've got 4 cups of flour, and a teaspoon of baking powder. And I'm just going to sift those together so that our baking powder is evenly distributed throughout the flour. Okay, there we go. And we're going to start incorporating the dry ingredients in with the mixture. And you know me, I always forget to have a scraper handy, but we want to make sure that we've got everything down off the edges of the bowl so that we've got all of that flour incorporated well. There we go. Okay, so there is our cookie dough all ready to go. So I'll just get this mixer out of the way and then we'll be ready for the next step. All right, so we have our cookie dough mixture all together here now. And I should mention at this point that I'm going to dedicate this particular show to Baxter and Cy down at Temperate Gardens in Eganville. I'm thinking it was 19 or more years ago. I taught Baxter how to make a Vinarterta, and ever since then, every Christmas, Baxter would make one for me. So I actually haven't had to make one in quite a while, which I think is pretty neat. That you teach a man you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, you teach him how to make Vinarterta, and he makes one for you every year. So hello to Baxter and Cy. If you're in Eganville, great place to go to get your flowers. Awesome products there. So next, I'm going to show you the next tip, which makes things easier. So when I was a kid, we would make these things, and like I say, you make them round. And if you can imagine trying to make 7 layers round exactly the same is tricky. So you'd always end up with some that were thick and some that were thin, and you would roll it out and you would put a plate on top of it and you would cut around that, and that was how we made them. But I've discovered a nifty little trick, and that is this thing here, which is basically just a macrame hoop. Get this at any craft store. I've got my 1/7 approximately of the dough leveled out. Of course, we've got flour on our board here, and then you have to have a really good strong rolling pin, because what we're going to do is we're going to roll this out, and we're going to let the ring cut it into the right size. And what I did there, because this is the first one and I was guessing at the amount that I needed, didn't have quite enough, but that's okay, we've got more. And the excess part just rolls over the edge. And your ring cuts it. And it comes out exactly the same thickness every time because it's the same thickness as the ring. Now that was our first one of the batch, so it'll be a little rough looking. So as you're making these things, you're going to want to save whatever is the best looking one for the top. And if you don't have a ring to make it with and you have ones that are slightly different thicknesses, save your thickest one for the bottom to be the strongest. Okay, and we're going to put it over onto our little cookie sheet here, which of course has got parchment paper on it. And we're going to pop this in the oven at 350 for about 7 or 8 minutes until it's golden. While that's happening, we roll out the second one, and then we just kind of get a little assembly line going until we've got 7 of these layers. And then there'll be a little bit of dough left over, and there's a trick that we're going to do with that. So we'll pop this in the oven, and we'll see you when the next few layers are ready. Okay, so we are just about to take our 7th layer out of the oven. These were 9-inch layers, and the recipe makes exactly 7 layers. And when I say exactly, I mean exactly. There is not a scrap left over. So the last one was kind of pieced together a little bit, but that's okay because we're going to put that into the middle. And if you choose to make a smaller one, you may end up with a bit of leftovers, in which case you get to make little mini cookies out of them. But now we're ready to put in some filling. And you'll notice that I have aluminum foil here, and I've got plastic wrap on top of that. If I had wax paper, I think that actually works a little better, but I didn't have any, so we're okay. So I put my strongest piece on the bottom, and I put about 3/4 of a layer of filling. Now the filling is made out of prunes. Now you can, in some cases, find pureed prunes at health food stores and bulk stores. In this case, I wasn't able to find any, so I was buying pitted prunes. So this is the other thing that is way easier than from when I was a kid. Because when I was a kid, you bought regular prunes that still had the pits in them. You had to cook them, and then you had to manually take every one of those pits out, which was a really gooey, yucky job. And then you ran it through the meat grinder. In this case, I had the pitted prunes. I put them in my slow cooker I covered them with water, just barely covered with water, in the slow cooker for about an hour to let them absorb all of that moisture, because you don't want them dried out. You want them to be able to smooth out nicely. I then added about a tablespoon of cardamom to the filling and put it through the meat grinder. Now, some recipes, including the recipe that I have, says to also add about 3/4 of a cup of sugar to the filling. Personally, I don't do that. I prefer to just have the natural flavor because I think there's enough sweetness in the cookies. But if you like things really sweet, go ahead and put some extra sugar in there. So now I've got my first layer on there, and what I did was I measured this out as I put it on, and this is about 3/4 of a cup. And once you've got that system down, you can just measure out 3/4 of a cup. If you had a smaller circumference, of course, you'd want a little bit less, because you want the filling and the cookie part to be about the same depth. So we'll start with that. We'll just give it a little bit of a push. And then I take I've got my 3/4 cup measure here, squish that onto the top. Now, if you don't have a meat grinder, you can run it through your food processor. Anything that is going to give you a smooth consistency, but you do have to definitely make sure that it is soft enough that you've got enough water in there. And even though I don't have it all the way to the edge, I'm going to take another cookie and just squish it in there, and by pressing down on it, that squeezes it down to the edge. Now what will happen is there will be spots right on the edge where you've kind of missed a little filling. That's okay, because when we go to cut it, it doesn't get cut in circles or triangles. It gets cut in squares. Don't ask me why you have a circular cake that gets cut in squares, or in rectangles actually, but you do. That's the traditional way. So that means that the cook, or her helper, gets to, his or her helper, I should say, gets to nibble on those off pieces off the end. Now what I've done is I've set one piece aside. I'm keeping this one in reserve because of the 7 pieces, that in my mind is the best looking one. Now some people like to put icing on the top of theirs, like either a buttercream icing with an almond flavoring added, or or actually marzipan will be sometimes used. Personally, I don't like it with the icing. I think that is just too much sweet on it. So I make a point of making sure I've got a nice looking layer on the top. But if you like, or if you don't have one that's good looking, or if you like things extra sweet, by all means you can go ahead and put icing on the top of this. But after it has aged, you wait until it's had a chance to sort of mellow out for a few days before you would do that. And the other thing that I did with this filling, like I said, I had put it in the slow cooker to cook it, but I also kept it warm. It's not overly warm, but it's warmer than room temperature. And by starting it off warm, it starts to mellow that much quicker. So you can get away with 3 or 4 days instead of waiting a whole week. Now this is our last cookie here. So that was the one that was a little bit broken. Now if we tried to put this together, or if we tried to cut it right now, these layers would be quite crispy, and they would actually crack if we tried to cut it right now. So that's another reason for letting it mellow a bit. And I don't know if there is a historical superstitious reason for there being 7 layers, but I always shoot for 7 layers. I mean, some recipes will say 6 or even 8. I find that 7 layers is the optimum number of layers for slicing and serving. If you go more than that, it's inclined to break apart. And if you go less than that, it doesn't look quite as spectacular. So. Now I do have a little bit more, maybe a cup of filling left over. It's it's sometimes a bit of a guessing game, but that's okay because that filling is actually really good on toast and just using it instead of jam. Or you can use it as filling in other cookies. If you have like a sugar cookie type dough or something, just cut them in a big circle and make like little pierogies stuffed with this, baked up. Okay, there we go. So now we're going to put the top layer on. And then we're going to take this saran wrap, or the plastic wrap, and fold it over. Okay, so now I'm going to put this in the fridge, and we will see you in a few days after it's had a chance to mellow. All right, so we're back. We've patiently waited about 4 days now for this to mellow. And we're going to open her up. This is where having wax paper is a little easier than the plastic wrap, because you can take it apart and then refold it again. Ooh, it smells wonderful. So got all of our layers intact. And this is the funny part, is we do this, it's a round cake, but we're going to cut it in squares. And we're going to start off with 1 layer. And so these little bits at the edges, that's what the cook gets to have. So you've always got these extra little nibbles. And sort of 1/2 to 3/4 inch. And take these these slices, and we're just going to trim the edges off of those. And then each one of these depends on what you're serving, about an inch is a typical size. And there we have it. Our Vinarterta is good to go. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Hilltop Stovetop, where we made the traditional Icelandic dessert, what we would often use here as Canadian Icelanders as our Christmas cake. So we've made Vinarterta, and it does take a few days, but it is well worth it. It's delicious, and I'm sure that everybody in your family will love it. We'll see you soon at another episode of Hilltop Stovetop.